Hi, my name is Faye Hazelgrave and I work at the University of South Australia. Now, before I moved here 11 years ago, I lived and worked in the UK, and Donald has just asked me to do a quick presentation just to give you an overview of some of the implications for PR practice in another country. So I want to begin really by framing my experience around Shuramich and Verchik's work. I think it provides a really good framework for understanding the various components and implications and considerations for PR practice on a global scale. So I can't begin without talking first of the cultural and socio-cultural environment in the UK. I've included just an image here just to give you a really clear idea of the kind of system that operates in the United Kingdom, in particular in England, which of course is where I spent a majority of my time. So let's start by looking at the differences in the class system. And there's a clear demarcation here between my experience of living in a cultural, social sense in the UK compared to my time spent here in Australia, where the social class system is certainly nowhere near as obvious. There are three dominant social classes. The first is the upper classes, and these are the people that are really in very privileged positions. So these are kind of the elite few and the aristocracy. So most of the time, the money that these people have has been inherited, has been passed down from many generations. So these are few and far between, if you like. The middle classes, now there's actually three levels of middle class: the lower middle, and the upper middle class. And the people that comprise this category are sometimes self-made, so these may be people that have over 2 or 3 generations perhaps changed their circumstances so that they've become fairly prudent in the way that they earn money and the way that they save money. But they're generally well educated. So again, there may be 2 or 3 generations that have already gone to university and have subsequently worked in professional roles and fairly sort of senior roles sometimes. So there's a majority of middle class people in the United Kingdom. But at the same time, there's the working class. And the working class, as this picture kind of depicts, I guess, is still very much alive, despite various attempts by various governments to disband this notion of a working class. Now, people in this category tend to work in manual labour or unskilled roles, or perhaps their parents did, and therefore they actually identify themselves as still possessing the working class values that they grew up with or that their parents instilled in them. Now, I would actually identify myself in this category. I was a first in family to go to uni, and my parents very much have worked in these kinds of manual, low-paid administrative roles. And I've just included a link here to an article about a very recent survey that actually shows, despite the relative wealth and the kind of positioning of the middle classes in UK, in British society, actually more people would identify themselves as being from the working classes. So there's still that sort of tension that exists there, but the class is a very important factor in British life, and the social system very much influences the way that the political, the economic, the cultural and the media environment has evolved and continues to do so. So how does culture then affect PR activity? Well, this social class and the value system that is attached to it, so how we perceive ourselves and where we position ourselves in relation to the broader social system, they're really important factors in democracy and also in communication. And I just wanted to give one example of what this might look like. There are actually in Australia, very many regional accents, and so politicians that one might expect to be very well spoken and of the sort of middle to upper middle class categories, they often will have regional accents, and yet how they are perceived by the public can very much influence voting behaviour just on the strength of an accent. So it's just one example I wanted to throw in, where class is so inherent in society, in British culture, that we look at somebody and we would deem immediately, do they have a posh accent? How well spoken are they? And therefore they must represent more right-wing views. Does that fit with my own political sensibilities? So they're the kinds of judgments that we make based on just one factor, being an accent. And of course, I'm sure you've already looked at credibility from the perspective of opinion leaders and influencers. But another major difference I have noticed with my time living in Australia compared to when I was in the UK, of course, is the landmass, the size of the country compared to Australia, and the population size. You know, we have a huge population, an ageing population, actually 65 million people in the UK. Now 54 million of those people live in England, 24 million people living in Australia, so we've got more than double that just living on a very small island, and that's created a very concentrated space in which we have integrated people from many different cultures. So, you know, there was quite a high immigration rate in the sort of 80s, 90s, and that's pushed out our the area in which we live, and has yet concentrated pockets of immigrants that tend to kind of congregate in those kind of more regional, localized areas, and that's created a really culturally and linguistically diverse society. And because of the lack of space and the number of people, of course, the living conditions are very different to over here. I remember looking at houses when I first moved here and couldn't believe the amount of space that house was built on, and they're single story. And of course, the flip side in the UK is that if you can afford a single story house, then you're really pretty well off, because all houses, due to lack of space, tend to be at least 2 stories and are quite narrow. So even that in itself can kind of produce a strange psychology, right? A strange alters the behaviour and the attitude sometimes of people, and that's something that for foreigners coming in and working there, I can imagine can often be quite challenging. And I've just included here that there's this sort of London Underground syndrome, where because of the close proximity in which you live, you tend to put blinkers on, and you don't necessarily engage or interact with people in the same way you do if you have freedom of space. So it's a very sort of psychological effect that happens, but that definitely does influence the working practices as well of people. But I think on the upside, having less physical space has produced a really efficient way of working. So not just efficiency in the design of architecture, but the efficiency of organisational practices as well, where, you know, there is less time, there's less resource, there's less space to get a job done. So we must do things as efficiently as possible. And of course, Australians commonly are ribbed for being very laid back. Well, in the UK, partly for the reasons I've said, it's the absolute opposite. It's heads down, let's get this done, let's do it as efficiently as we possibly can, let's move on to the next thing. So that's more of a feeling, I guess, rather than something that you can see. You need to be immersed in any society for a long enough period of time before you can appreciate those kinds of nuances. And because of the high levels of unemployment and social inequality in the UK, there is often high levels of activism that take place, and this is something that Shuramich and Verchik actually pick up in one of the readings that I believe that you will have in this course. Now, on the upside of that, that's actually created opportunities for PR practice. So there are lots of examples where social marketing, and I'll talk to you in a bit about one I was involved in, came in that particularly with the emergence of social media, that enabled organisations to leverage technology to access communities and increase awareness to issues where people may not have been previously. And as a result, that can help readjust or realign those kinds of social inequities that exist in many pockets of society in the UK. So because of the levels of activism and because of the sophistication in activist routines, you know, the kinds of or organised activism that takes place, it's meant that that it has actually opened up quite a lot of opportunity for people that want to practice in that area. And I'll mention lobbying a bit more in the next slide. So as with any PR activity, of course, global international PR requires in-depth knowledge of the demographics and psychographics of the people that you're dealing with. And now in the UK, I mentioned that there's a large proportion of immigrants with lots of different cultures. I wanted to demonstrate this fact by just highlighting a case study, a project that I was involved in. And now it goes back a little while, I know, but in 2004, this was just prior to social media, so Facebook wasn't around. Websites were still pretty much one way, they were static, so they weren't Web 2 technologies that we have today. So we had to design a campaign that drew attention to the issue of smoking in public places. Now, I don't know if any of you will recall this, but Australia led the way and actually became, ironically for me, as it turned out, became the exemplar for instigating legislation that protected people from the effects of secondhand smoking. And the success in which Australia managed to implement new laws actually inspired the government activity of the time. I worked for the Department of Health, and we wanted to emulate something very similar. So we developed this campaign to draw attention to and raise awareness of. So it wasn't about changing behaviour, it was really just about seeking the input, the opinion of the public. So this was a part of a public consultation, this campaign. It was integrated marketing, so we used a combination, again remembering that online activity wasn't huge at this point in time. So we used what we had to hand. So we had billboards, bus shelters, backs of buses as well, and media relations. Now media relations in that time very much relied on interpersonal relationships with journalists. So using your feet to get on the ground and go visit them and brief them on the campaign. We used predominantly a paper and online survey. So it was online with this static, simple web page that we had, and it just asked a number of closed and some open questions, all around the places where people felt smoking should and shouldn't be allowed. So that was the data we were trying to collect. Now, I mentioned before about having a linguistically and culturally diverse society. This was conducted in an area, in a region that had a lot of people from various different countries and cultures that may have been born here but often had immigrated here, so were first generation. So we needed to acknowledge that and understand the kinds of languages that were spoken in this region in England. And we actually had the survey translated into 9 languages. These were distributed to those cultural scenes where those people would have congregated. So it wasn't just a case of sending them, using the newspaper, which was one of the methods we had. We inserted a paper survey into that newspaper. But we needed to reach the community. We needed to engage with our stakeholders and maintain a relationship with them. So we did that by utilising our networks in our local health organisations, and they distributed the survey through those various venues you can see on the screen. Now in the region of East Midlands in England, there's 4.5 million, which again is a significant number of people. It equates to the population size in Queensland, and this is really quite a small part of England, one of 9 government regions. So just to give you a bit more context, I guess, about the kind of job that I was involved in, I was a communications manager in the public health team in England. And part of that role meant that I produced communication and media briefings for ministers. So the public health minister needed to obviously be informed about any issues that had occurred in that region that we were responsible for, and to answer any questions that may have been posed in Parliament about those particular issues. And because of the position that I had, whilst I wasn't based in London, I was very much literally in the middle of the country. I was required to have many meetings in Westminster, and of course that's the hub where all of the fascinating, wonderful policies and decisions get made. So it did mean that I managed to be quite involved in the development of communication strategies on a national level. And that actually meant that I felt quite involved in some of those communication campaigns that I was asked to lead on. Felt because of the 3-tier structure, working at a state government level, that actually I've had less influence as a communicator. So I felt as though my strategic role has been diluted somewhat compared to my experience in the UK. And I think that's something that's really important for you to think about if ever you choose to work in the public sector over in the UK, in England in particular, I should say, that the political structure is vastly different, and you may think that just having one extra level can't really change things too much, but it absolutely does. And I mentioned before about the high levels of activism. Now, obviously, these are usually generated through social, or the drive for social change. And these might be conducted by grassroots organisations, or members of the public can also, of course, be corporations. But at that level, it tends to become a lobbying activity. And in the UK, is a really well-established and well-functioning practice. And private lobbying is really quite common, where corporations will arrange, and ministers will arrange, private meetings with journalists to give them off-the-record briefings, and vice versa, for journalists to talk to the other party about any stories that they've identified or want to investigate. And those things are equally part of that lobbyist activity than those that you see conducted publicly on the streets. And in Australia, in contrast, whilst it has grown in the last decade or so, it is less regulated. So I just wanted to finish by looking at the media system. So we've considered the social, cultural factors in Schirmish-Verchick's framework. We looked at the political environment. And now I just wanted to look at some of the differences in the media systems, and also, of course, the similarities. The first similarity, of course, is that we both have public broadcasters. So in the UK, we have the BBC, and here in Australia, we have the ABC. Now in the UK, Murdoch's newspaper empire takes up 32.5% of the market share. In Australia, we have a much higher figure in the same market, 57.5%. Now, Rupert Murdoch, of course, has his finger in many pies in different markets all over the world. But these are significant figures that represent only his newspaper assets. Of course, he has market share in other media as well. And in Australia at the moment, it is highly contested, this issue of media ownership and the concentration that we have over here, particularly since the rules were very recently changed. The legislation was abolished that previously protected the public, and there is at the moment more of a duopoly situation in Australia, and there is a little bit more diversity currently in the UK. That said, there are two types of newspaper in the UK, and these are again very much linked to social class. So I just wanted to emphasise the connections that exist here and how culture and social structure is so deeply embedded and rooted in everyday life. The tabloid news, I've included a couple here. So we'll see the influence in particular of Murdoch's empire. And these are well known for sensationalist news, entertainment, the kind of cheap, lowbrow form of information that is traditionally associated with the working classes. And then we have the broadsheet newspaper, so the Financial Times and the Guardian, and these have always been considered to be slightly more credible in content and more reliable, and therefore aimed more at the middle classes. And both newspapers, types of newspaper, tend to lean either to the left or to the right. So there's very much that political association and connection in the way news is reported too. And we also, of course, have regional and local newspapers, and that's very much the same as it is over here. But in both cases, of course, we see how media ownership have the potential to exert much power and influence over the way, over public opinion and the way that we see things and the way that we view the world. And of course, they're very much connected as well with political life and social issues. And I've just included another story here that actually was a fact check. So a claim was made fairly recently that Australia is among the highest when it comes to media ownership concentration. And this fact check by this scholar that wrote for The Conversation actually did conclude that that very much is the case. So I hope you found some of what I've said of interest, and it's given you some pause for thought when considering what PR practice might be like in the UK. Thank you very much.